President Bola Ahmed Tinubu of Nigeria has issued a revised policy actions over the 2025 presidential pardons he had earlier granted to 175 persons, some of whom were convicted murderers, deadly kidnappers, which included Maryam Sanda, who had spent barely 6 years and 8 months at the Suleja Medium Security Custodial Center after she was convicted and sentenced to death by hanging over the killing of her husband, Bilyaminu Bello in Abuja, who she stabbed 3 times repeatedly. This, President Bola Ahmed Tinubu in his earlier presidential pardon granted to the 37-years-old convicted and condemned murderer, Maryam Sanda, had asked her to go home free because of her children, but, following public outcry and condemnation, in the revised version of the presidential pardon signed into law on October 21, 2025 and made available to the public by the Presidency on Wednesday, October 29, 2025, President Tinubu commuted the death sentence to 12 years imprisonment, although the Presidency never mentioned the total numbers of people granted the presidential pardons, but the list of beneficiaries made available by the Presidential Spokesperson, Bayo Onanuga, indicated that only 86 persons were granted the presidential pardons, and Maryam Sanda, apparently spelt as Maryam Sunda, was last on the list, and the names of earlier beneficiaries like Kelvin Prosper Oniarah were not seen in the revised edition of the list. Maybe the names were omitted due to excessive public outcry that Prosper Kelvin Oniarah was a convicted, notorious, high-profile gang leader of a deadly kidnapping group that were widely stated to be responsible for the kidnapping and subsequent killing of a former Anambra State Deputy Governor, Chudi Nwike, kidnapping of a prominent legal practitioner, Mike Ozhekome, on August 24, 2013 along Benin-Auchi Road, and during the kidnapping operation, the gunman ambushed and killed 4 police officers including the Divisional Police Officer, DPO of Ehor Division, who led the police team in an attempt to rescue Mike Ozhekome. Outside that, the 44-years-old Oniarah was also stated to be responsible for the kidnapping of a judge in the Edo State Judiciary, a top female official of the Federal Inland Revenue Service, FIRS, among other several members of the National Youth Service Corps, NYSC, and security agents. And Oniarah was also stated to carry out several armed robberies and kidnap operations in Delta, Edo, Rivers and Anambra States, maintaining operational base and detention camps in Warri and Kokori Community in Delta State, Ugbokolo Community in Benue State, Benin City in Edo State, and Abia in Abia State. That on the 18th of September 2013, Oniarah issued a 60-day ultimatum to the federal government of Nigeria to release some of his boys who were arrested by the Department of State Services, DSS, or he would wreak havoc on innocent Nigerian citizens, and, on the 25th of September 2013, a combined security team of the Nigerian Army and DSS operatives arrested Kelvin Prosper Oniarah, a convicted notorious terrorist, kidnap kingpin and armed robber, who had been on the wanted list of the security agencies, and he was subsequently sentenced to 20 years imprisonment, which he had spent 12 years in prison before President Bola Ahmed Tinubu had initially made an attempt to release him. Details of the 3 press releases issued by the Presidency in the course of the 2025 presidential pardons that elicited public outcry and rejections are presented verbatim in a descending order of latest to former below. President Tinubu signs Instrument of Clemency and Pardons, moves Secretariat of Prerogative of Mercy Committee to Justice Ministry. President Bola Ahmed Tinubu, GCFR, has executed the relevant instruments of release to complete the process of formally exercising his constitutional power of prerogative of mercy to grant pardon and clemency to specific individuals who were earlier convicted for various offenses. Following consultations with the Council of State and Public Opinion on the matter, the President directed a further review of the initially approved list for consideration in furtherance of the President's discretionary powers under Section 175, 1, and 2 of the 1999 Constitution, as amended. Consequently, certain persons convicted of serious crimes such as kidnapping, drug-related offenses, human trafficking, fraud, unlawful possession of firearms, arms dealing, etc., were deleted from the list. Others who had been hitherto pardoned in the old list had their sentences commuted. This action became necessary in view of the seriousness and security implications of some of the offenses, the need to be sensitive to the feelings of the victims of the crimes and society in general, the need to boost the morale of law enforcement agencies and adherence to bilateral obligations. The concept of justice as a three-way traffic for the accused, the victim, and the state, society also guided the review. The approved list of eligible beneficiaries has been transmitted to the Nigerian Correctional Service for implementation in line with the duly signed instruments of release. Furthermore, to ensure that future exercises meet public expectations and best practices, the President has directed the immediate relocation of the Secretariat of the Presidential Advisory Committee on Prerogative of Mercy from the Federal Ministry of Special Duties to the Federal Ministry of Justice. President Tinubu also directed the Attorney General of the Federation to issue appropriate guidelines for the exercise of the power of prerogative of mercy, which includes compulsory consultation with relevant prosecuting agencies. This will ensure that only persons who fully meet the stipulated legal and procedural requirements will henceforth benefit from the issuance of instruments of release. The President appreciated the constructive feedback and engagement from stakeholders and the general public on this matter. President Tinubu also reaffirmed his administration's broader commitment to judicial reforms and improving the administration of justice in Nigeria. Signed, Bayo Onanuga, Special Advisor to the President on Information and Strategy on October 29, 2025. Presidential Prerogative of Mercy exercise at review stage, not final, AGF Fagbemi. The Office of the Attorney General of the Federation and Minister of Justice wishes to clarify that no inmate approved for clemency under the recent exercise of the President's power of prerogative of mercy has been released from custody. The process remains at the final administrative stage, which includes a standard review to ensure that all names and recommendations fully comply with established legal and procedural requirements before any instrument of release is issued. It is important to note that the last stage of the exercise, after approval by the Council of State, is the issuance of the instrument for the implementation of the decision concerning each beneficiary. This stage affords an opportunity for a final look at the list for remedial purposes, if any, before the instrument is forwarded to the Controller General of Corrections for necessary action. This verification process is part of the standard protocol and reflects the government's commitment to transparency and due diligence. The Honorable Attorney General of the Federation and Minister of Justice appreciates the public's vigilance and constructive feedback, which continue to strengthen institutional integrity. Public engagement is always welcome, as it demonstrates that Nigerians care deeply about justice and good governance. There is no delay in the process. It is simply following the law to the letter to ensure that only those duly qualified benefit from the President's mercy. As soon as all legal and procedural checks are concluded, the public will be duly informed. The rule of law does not rush. It ensures fairness. Signed, Prince Lateef Fagbemi, SAN, Attorney General of the Federation and Minister of Justice on October 16, 2025. Details of the Presidential Pardon and Clemency. Illegal minors, white-collar convicts, remorseful drug offenders, foreigners, Major General Mammon Vatsa, Major Akubo, Professor Magaji Garba, capital offenders such as Maryam Sanda, Kensaro Wiwa, and the other Ogoni 8 were among the 175 convicts and former convicts who received President Bola Ahmed Tinubu's mercy on Thursday. Nwike Francis Chibus, aged 44, serving a life sentence at Kirikiri for cocaine. Dr. Nwogu Peters, aged 67, serving a 17-year jail term for fraud. Sentenced in 2013, Mrs. Anastasia Daniel Nwaba, aged 63, already served a sentence for fraud. Barrister Hussaini Al-Haji Umar, aged 58, sentenced in 2023 to pay a fine of 150 million nairas in the ICPC case. Ayla Sadu Alanamu, age 63, was sentenced to 7 years for bribery in 2019 and has served the sentence. Honorable Farouk M. Lawan, aged 62, sentenced to 5 years in 2021 for corrupt practices and had served the sentence. President Tinubu granted clemency to most of them based on the reports that the convicts had shown remorse and good conduct. He forgave some due to old age, the acquisition of new vocational skills, or enrollment in the National Open University of Nigeria, (NOUN). President Tinubu also corrected the historic injustice committed by British colonialists against Sir Herbert Macaulay, one of Nigeria's foremost nationalists. In all, the Presidential Advisory Committee on the Prerogative of Mercy, chaired by the Attorney General and Justice Minister, Prince Lateef Olasunkanmi Fagbemi, recommended pardon for 2 inmates, 15 former convicts, 11 of whom have died. The committee recommended clemency for 82 inmates and commutation of sentences for 65 inmates. 7 inmates on death row also benefited from the presidential reprieve. The committee recommended that the president should commute the death sentences to life imprisonment. Prince Fagbemi presented the committee's report at the Council of State meeting, chaired by President Bola Ahmed Tinubu. Full list of beneficiaries of President Tinubu's mercy. Pardoned. Posthumous pardon. Sir Herbert Macaulay was banned from public office for misappropriation of funds and sentenced in 1913 by the British colonialists. Ken Saro Wiwa, sentenced for murder. Saturday Doby, sentenced for murder. Nordu Iwa, sentenced for murder. Daniel Buko, sentenced for murder. Paul Levera, sentenced for murder. Felix Nwate, sentenced for murder. Barabor Bera, sentenced for murder. Barinam Kiobel, sentenced for murder. John Queen, sentenced for murder. Major General Maman Giyavatsa, age 46, sentenced in 1986 for treason, related to an alleged coup plot. Posthumous pardon, and honors, the Ogoni 9, victims of Ogoni 9 honored. Chief Albert Beatty, Chief Edward Kobaru, Chief Samuel Oraj, Chief Theophilus Oraj. Presidential clemency. Most of the beneficiaries showed either remorse or learned vocational skills in jail. Ben Friday, aged 60, was sentenced to 3 years or 1.3 million nairas fine for marijuana in 2023. Aluagwu Lawrence, aged 47, sentenced for Indian hemp selling, 2015. Orok Michael Chibus, aged 21, sentenced to 5 years, cannabis sativa, in 2023. Kelvin Christopher Smith, aged 42, was sentenced to 4 years for importing cocaine in 2023. Azabuki Jeremiah Emeka, aged 31, sentenced in 2021 to 5 years or 3 million nairas fine for importing cocaine. Akinrene Akinwande Adabi, aged 47, sentenced in 2023 to 3 years for dealing in tramadol. Ahmed Adeyemo, aged 38, sentenced to 15 years for cannabis. Already served 9 years, 5 months at Kirikiri. Adeniyi Jimo, aged 31 years, sentenced to 15 years for drugs in 2015 and served 9 years at Kirikiri. Sian Omarind, aged 39, sentenced to 15 years for drugs in 2015. Served 9 years at Kirikiri. Adesanya Olafemi Paul, aged 61, sentenced to 14 years for theft. Had served 8 years. If Yusuf, aged 37, was sentenced for human trafficking in 2019. Had served 6 years at Kirikiri. Daniel Bodenwa, aged 43, was sentenced in 2018 to 10 years for fraudulent intent to forge a land receipt. Had served 6 years in jail. Fidelis Michael, aged 40, sentenced to 5 years for cannabis sativa. Suru Akande, aged 52, sentenced to 5 years for cannabis sativa. Safiyanu Umar, aged 56, sentenced to 5 years without the option of a fine for possessing 5 kilograms of cannabis sativa, 2023. Dahiru Abdullahi, aged 46, was sentenced in 2016 to 21 years for possession of 3 pistols and had spent 10 years in jail. Hamza Abubakar, aged 37, sentenced to 5 years for Indian hemp selling, 2022. Rabiu Al-Hassan Dawaki, aged 52, sentenced in 2020 to 7 years for criminal breach of trust. Mujabu Muhammad, aged 30, sentenced in 2022 to 5 years, no option for a fine for cannabis. Emmanuel Ez, aged 49, sentenced in 2022 to 5 years for heroin. Bala Azika Yahaya, aged 70, sentenced in 2017 to 15 years for cannabis. Lena Kusum Wilson, aged 34, sentenced to death in 2017 for culpable homicide, had spent 8 years in jail. Buhari Sani, aged 33, sentenced in 2022 to 5 years for possession of 558 grams of cannabis. Muhammad Musa, aged 27, was sentenced in 2022 to 5 years for possession of 16 grams of cannabis. Maharazu Abubakar, aged 37, sentenced in 2022 to 5 years for selling Indian hemp. Already spent 3 years in Katsina prison. Ibrahim Yusuf, aged 34, jailed 5 years in 2022 for possession of 5.7 grams of Indian hemp. Saad Ahmed Madaki, aged 72, sentenced in 2020 for a 419 offense. Had served 4 years in Kaduna prison. Ex-Corporal Michael Bawa, aged 72, sentenced to life imprisonment for murder in 2005. Had spent 20 years in Kaduna prison. Richard Ayuba, aged 38, sentenced to 5 years in 2022 for Indian hemp. Adam Abubakar, aged 30 and sentenced in 2022 to 5 years for possession of 2 kilograms of tramadol. Emmanuel Yusuf, aged 34, sentenced in 2022 to 4 years for possession of 2 kilograms of tramadol. Edwin Nazor, aged 60, sentenced in 2018 to 15 years for cannabis. Had spent 6 years, 9 months at Zamfara prison. Shindu Stanley, aged 34. Sentenced in 2023 to 3 years for fake lubricant oil. Joseph Nwanoka, aged 42, sentenced in 2022 to 5 years for drugs. Johnny N.T. Heru, aged 63, sentenced in 1989 to life imprisonment for robbery. Had spent 36 years in Umuahia prison. John Omotie, aged 28, sentenced to 6 years for pipeline vandalism. Enzikitede Harry, aged 37, sentenced in 2023 to 5 years for illegal possession of Indian hemp, cocaine, and heroin. Jonathan Asuko, aged 28, sentenced in 2022 to 5 years for possession of Indian hemp and other drugs. Prince Samuel Peters, aged 54, sentenced in 2020 to 7 years for obtaining money by false pretense. Had spent 4 years, 3 months in Iketekpene prison. Babangida Saliu, aged 35, sentenced in 2024 to 3 years for unlawful mining. Adamu Sani, aged 39, sentenced in 2024 to 3 years for unlawful mining. Abdul Karem Salisu, aged 30, sentenced to 3 years for unlawful mining. Abdulaziz Lawal, aged 18, sentenced to 3 years for unlawful mining. Abdul Rahman Babangida, aged 20, sentenced to 3 years for unlawful mining. Maharazu Aladu, aged 22, sentenced to 3 years for unlawful mining. Zahareddin Baliwe, aged 38, sentenced to 3 years for unlawful mining. Babangida Usman, aged 30, sentenced to 3 years for unlawful mining. Zayanu Abdullahi, aged 28, sentenced to 3 years for unlawful mining, 2024. Bashir Garuba, aged 20, sentenced in 2024 to 3 years for unlawful mining. Imam Suleiman, aged 25, sentenced to 3 years for unlawful mining, 2024. Abba Amisu, aged 28, sentenced to 3 years for unlawful mining, 2024. Lawani Lowanu, aged 20, sentenced to 3 years for unlawful mining, 2024. Yusuf Al-Hassan, aged 33, was sentenced to 3 years for unlawful mining in 2024. Abdullahi Isa, aged 25, sentenced to 3 years for unlawful mining, 2024. Bilyaminu Bello, aged 35, sentenced to 3 years for unlawful mining. Habib Suleiman, aged 22, sentenced in 2024 to 3 years for unlawful mining. Jubran Sahabi, aged 23, was sentenced to 3 years in 2024 for unlawful mining. Shfiu Umar, aged 28, was sentenced to 3 years in 2024 for unlawful mining. Saidu Abubakar, aged 29, sentenced in 2024 to 3 years for unlawful mining. Haruna Abubakar, aged 24, was sentenced to 3 years in 2024 for unlawful mining. Rabiu Saidu, aged 26, sentenced in 2024 to 3 years for unlawful mining. Maher Kuru, aged 25, sentenced in 2024 to 3 years for unlawful mining. Zahraddin Aminu, aged 25 years, sentenced to 3 years for unlawful mining. Nazifi Musa, aged 25, sentenced to 3 years for unlawful mining in 2024. Abdullahi Musa, aged 30 and sentenced to 3 years in 2024 for unlawful mining. Habibu Safiu, aged 20 and sentenced to 3 years in 2024 for unlawful mining. Hassani Sani, aged 21 and sentenced to 3 years in 2024 for unlawful mining. Musa Lawali, aged 25 and sentenced to 3 years in 2024 for unlawful mining. Suleiman Lawal, aged 23 and sentenced to 3 years in 2024 for unlawful mining. Yusuf Ilyasu, aged 21 and sentenced to 3 years in 2024 for unlawful mining. Sebiu Aliyu, aged 20 and sentenced to 3 years in 2024 for unlawful mining. Holaru Sani, aged 18 and sentenced to 3 years in 2024 for unlawful mining. Shitu Aliyu, aged 30 and sentenced to 3 years in 2024 for unlawful mining. Sanusi Aminu, aged 27 and sentenced to 3 years in 2024 for unlawful mining. Isiaka Adamu, aged 40 and sentenced to 3 years in 2024 for unlawful mining. Maman Ibrahim, aged 50 and sentenced to 3 years in 2024 for unlawful mining. Shwaibu Abdullahi, aged 35 and sentenced to 3 years in 2024 for unlawful mining. Sanusi Adamu, aged 28 and sentenced to 3 years in 2024 for unlawful mining. Sadi Musa, aged 20 and sentenced to 3 years in 2024 for unlawful mining. Haruna Isa, aged 35 and sentenced to 3 years in 2024 for unlawful mining. Note: Senator Ikra Aliyu Bilbas signed an undertaking to be responsible for the rehabilitation and empowerment of all the convicted illegal miners granted presidential clemency. Abiodun Elamero, aged 43, sentenced to life imprisonment for cocaine hawking in 2014, had spent 10 years plus in Kirikiri. Maryam Sanda, aged 37, was sentenced to death in 2020 for culpable homicide and had spent 6 years, 8 months at Suleja Medium Security Custodial Center. Her family pleaded for her release, arguing that it was in the best interest of her 2 children. The plea was also anchored on her good conduct in jail, her remorse, and her embracement of a new lifestyle, demonstrating her commitment to being a model prisoner. List of inmates on death row reduced to life imprisonment. Emmanuel Barber, aged 38, sentenced to death in 2017 for culpable homicide. On death row in Kuje Custodial Center for the past 8 years. The sentence was commuted to life imprisonment based on good conduct and remorsefulness. Emmanuel Gladstone, aged 45, was sentenced in 2020 to death for murder and had spent 5 years at Katsina Custodial Center. Death sentence commuted to life imprisonment due to good conduct and remorse. Moses Ayodele Olorunfemi, aged 51, sentenced to death in 2012 for culpable homicide and had spent 13 years on death row in Katsina. President Tinubu commuted the death sentence to life imprisonment, citing the individual's good conduct and remorse. Abu Bakar Usman, aged 59, sentenced to death in 2014 and had spent 14 years on death row in Katsina. His sentence was commuted to life because of his remorse and good conduct. Khalifa Umar, aged 37, sentenced to death in 2014 and had spent 11 years on death row in Kano Custodial Center. His sentence has been commuted to life imprisonment. Benjamin Ekeze, age 40, sentenced to death in 2017 for armed robbery and conspiracy, and had spent 12 years on death row at Kirikiri, Lagos. The sentence was also commuted to life. Muhammad Umar, 43, sentenced to death in 2018 for culpable homicide and had spent 7 years on death row in Onitsha Custodial Center. He got the presidential reprieve, commuting the death sentence to life imprisonment. List of inmates recommended for reduced term of imprisonment. Yusuf Owolabi, aged 36, sentenced to life in 2015 for manslaughter, had spent 10 years at Kirikiri. Prison term reduced to 12 years for showing remorse and learning vocational skills. Afenyi Ez, aged 33, sentenced to life in 2021 for manslaughter and had spent 4 years at Kirikiri. Prison term reduced to 12 years for showing remorse and learning vocational skills. Malam Ibrahim Suleiman, aged 59, sentenced to life in 2022 for armed robbery and possession of illegal firearms. Sentence cut to 10 years based on good conduct. Shatima Maji Arfo, aged 54, sentenced in 2021 to 7 years for corrupt practices. Sentence reduced to 4 years, because of good conduct and ill health. Ajaspa Benziga, aged 69 and sentenced in 2015 to 20 years for culpable homicide. Sentence reduced to 12 years, based on old age and ill health. Ifena Kenekukwu, aged 42, sentenced in 2015 to 20 years for drugs, cocaine import, and had spent close to 10 years in Kirikiri. Prison term reduced to 12 years based on remorse and the acquisition of vocational skills. M.G. Bike Matthew, aged 45, sentenced to 20 years in 2013 for the import of 3.10 kilograms. Following remorsefulness and the acquisition of vocational skills at Kirikiri, sentence reduced to 12 years. Patrick Mensah, aged 40, sentenced in 2015 to 17 years for drugs. Sentence reduced to 11 years. Obi Edwin Chukwu, aged 43 and sentenced in 2017 to 15 years for drugs. Sentence reduced to 10 years. Tunde Balogun, aged 32 and sentenced in 2015 to 15 years for drugs. Sentence reduced to 10 years. Lima Pereira Eric Diego, aged 27 and sentenced in 2017 to 15 years or a fine of 20 million nairas for drugs. Sentence reduced to 10 years. Uchegbu Emeka Michael, aged 37, sentenced in 2017 to 15 years or a fine of N20 million for drugs. Sentence reduced to 10 years. Salawu Adebayo Samsudeen, aged 46 and sentenced in 2016 to 15 years for drugs. Sentence reduced to 10 years. Napolo Osiri-Aman, aged 61 and sentenced in 2022 to 15 years for 2 kilos of Indian hemp. The sentence was reduced to 7 years. Patricia Echo Igninovia, aged 61 and sentenced in 2023 to 7 years for trafficking in persons. Sentence reduced to 5 years. Odeyemi Omolaram, aged 65 and sentenced in 2017 to 25 years in prison for drug. The sentence was reduced to 12 years based on the defendant's remorsefulness and advanced age. Vera Daniela Fork, aged 29 and sentenced in 2020 to 10 years for trafficking in persons. Sentence reduced to 8 years. Gabriel Juliet Chidima, aged 32 and sentenced in 2022 to 6 years for drug, cocaine. Sentence reduced to 4 years. Diaz Santos Marcio Cristiana, aged 44 and sentenced in 2017 to 15 years for import of cocaine. Sentence reduced to 10 years. Alhaji Ibrahim Hamid, aged 71 and sentenced in 2023 to 7 years for illegal property, obtaining property under false pretense. Sentence reduced to 5 years. Alhaji Nasiru Agara Adinoyi, 65, was sentenced in 2023 to 14 years for obtaining property by false pretense. The sentence was reduced to 7 years. Chief Emeka Agbodike, aged 69, was sentenced in 2023 to 7 years for obtaining property by false pretense. Sentence reduced to 3 years. Isaac Justina, aged 40, sentenced in 2022 to 10 years for cannabis sativa and had spent 3 years in the Abia State Custodial Center. Sentence reduced to 4 years. Aishat Kahinde, aged 38 and sentenced in 2022 to 5 years for unlawful possession of cannabis. The prison term being served in Abia State has been reduced to 4 years. Helen Solomon, aged 68, sentenced in 2024 to 5 years for cannabis sativa. Sentence reduced to 3 years. Okoye Tochukwu, aged 43 and sentenced in 2024 to 6 years for cannabis sativa. Sentence reduced to 3 years. Ugueze Paul, aged 38 and sentenced in 2024 to 6 years for cannabis sativa. Sentence reduced to 3 years. Mustafa Ahmed, aged 46 and sentenced in 2022 to 7 years without a fine option for criminal breach of trust. The sentence was reduced to 5 years. Abu Bakar Mammon, aged 38 and sentenced in 2020 to 10 years in Kebbi Custodial Center for possession of firearms. Sentence reduced to 7 years. Muhammad Bello Musa, aged 35, sentenced in 2020 to 10 years in Kebbi Custodial Center for illegal possession of firearms. Sentence reduced to 7 years. Namdi Annan, aged 67 and sentenced in 2010 to life imprisonment at Katsina Custodial Center for illegal dealing of arms. Sentence reduced to 20 years. ALH, Abu Bakar Tanko, aged 61, was sentenced in 2018 to 30 years at the Gusau Custodial Center for culpable homicide. Sentence reduced to 20 years. Chisholm Francis Wisdom, aged 30, sentenced in 2018 to 20 years in Umuahia Custodial Center for kidnapping. Sentence reduced to 12 years. Innocent Brown Idiong, aged 60, sentenced in 2020 to 10 years for possession of 700 grams of Indian hemp. Has already spent 4 years and 3 months at Ikitabasi Custodial Center. Jail term reduced to 6 years. Iniabong Amayan Intikidim, aged 46, was sentenced 2021 to 7 years in jail at the Uyo Custodial Center. Prison term reduced to 5 years. Ada Audu, aged 72, was sentenced in 2022 to 7 years in Kuje Custodial Center and had spent 2 years and 7 months in prison. Prison term reduced to 4 years because of old age. Bakar Adamu, aged 40 and sentenced to 20 years in 2019 for advance fee fraud. Prison term reduced to 9 years. Kelvin Oniarah Azigbe, 44, was sentenced in October 2023 to 20 years for kidnapping, which took effect in 2013. The sentence was reduced to 13 years for showing remorsefulness and attending the National Open University. Frank Azwekor, aged 42, sentenced in 2023 for kidnapping and jailed in Kuje Custodial Center for 20 years, and had spent 12 years behind bars from 2013. The sentence was reduced to 13 years, based on good conduct and attendance at the National Open University. Chukwukalu Sunday Kalisthis, aged 47 and sentenced in 2014 to life at Kuje Custodial Center for drugs. He had spent 11 years at Kuje. Sentence reduced to 13 years. Professor Magaji Garba, aged 67, sentenced in 2021 to 7 years for obtaining money by false pretense and had spent 3 years at Kuje Custodial Center. The prison term was reduced to 4 years due to good conduct and advanced age. Marcus Yusuf, aged 41, sentenced in 2023 to 13 years for culpable homicide. Sentence reduced to 5 years based on ill health. Samson Ajayi, aged 31 and sentenced in 2022 to 15 years. For drugs, he had spent 5 years at Suleja Custodial Center. The sentence was reduced to 7 years. Iyabo Binyoyo, aged 49, sentenced in 2017 to 10 years for drugs and sentenced to 9 years at Suleja Custodial Center, due to good conduct. Oladele Felix, 49, was sentenced in 2022 to 5 years without a fine option for conspiracy and exploitation. Based on good conduct and remorsefulness, the sentence was reduced to 4 years. Felix is spending the term at Suleja. Rakia Bida, aged 33 and sentenced in 2021 to 7 years, without a fine option, for theft and cheating. The sentence, being served at Suleja, was reduced to 3 years based on good conduct. In Ryagu Augustine Afeni, aged 44 and sentenced in 2018 to 10 years in Ikoyi Custodial Center, for exporting cocaine. The sentence was reduced to 8 years. Chukwudi Destiny, aged 36 and sentenced in 2022 to 6 years in Ikoyi Custodial Center for heroin import. The sentence was cut to 4 years. Felix Rotimi Esamokai, aged 47 and sentenced in 2022 to 5 years for heroin. The sentence was reduced to 4 years. Major S.A. Okubo, aged 62, was sentenced in 2009 to life at Katsina Custodial Center for illegally removing 7,000 assorted weapons. Following good conduct and remorsefulness, the sentence was commuted to 20 years. John Ibiam, aged 39, was sentenced in 2016 to 15 years for manslaughter and served 9 years and 1 month in the Afikpo Custodial Center. The sentence was reduced to 10 years after the individual showed remorse and acquired vocational skills. Omoko Aja, aged 40 and sentenced in 2016 to 15 years for manslaughter, served 9 years and 1 month in Afikpo Custodial Center. The sentence was commuted to 10 years. Chief Jonathan Alatoru, aged 66, was sentenced in 2021 to 7 years for conspiracy to cheat. The sentence served in Port Harcourt Custodial Center has been reduced to 5 years. Umana Ekeret Umana, aged 70 and sentenced in 2022 to 10 years in Port Harcourt Custodial Center for forgery. Sentence reduced to 5 years due to old age and remorsefulness. Utam Obong Thompson Udoka, 60, was sentenced in 2020 to 7 years in Ikitek Pene Custodial Center for obtaining money by false pretense. He had served 4 years and 2 months at Ikitek Pene. Due to his old age and good conduct, the initial sentence has been reduced to 5 years. Jude Sakar Abaraha, aged 44, sentenced in 2020 to 12 years at Ikoyi prison and a fine of 1 million nairas for conspiracy to hijack a fishing vessel. The sentence was commuted to 6 years, and the 1 million nairas fine was waived. Frank Insortabaka, 46, was sentenced in 2020 to 12 years and a 1 million nairas fine at Ikoyi Custodial Center for conspiracy to hijack a fishing vessel. The sentence was reduced to 6 years, and the fine was waived. Sheena Alalo, 42, was sentenced in 2020 to 12 years and a 1 million nairas fine at Ikoyi Custodial Center for conspiracy to hijack a fishing vessel. Like others, the N1 meter fine was waived, and the sentence was reduced to 6 years. Joshua Iwiki, aged 50, sentenced in 2020 to 12 years at Ikoyi prison and a fine of 1 million nairas for conspiracy to hijack a fishing vessel. An 1 meter fine was waived, and the sentence was commuted to 6 years in prison. David Akinseye, aged 44, sentenced in 2020 to 12 years and 1 million nairas fine for conspiracy to hijack a fishing vessel. His sentence was commuted to 6 years, and the fine was waived. Ahmed Toyan, aged 46, sentenced in 2020 to 12 years and 1 million nairas fine for conspiracy to hijack a fishing vessel. Sentence also commuted and fine waived. Shobajo Sahid, age 57, sentenced in 2020 to 12 years and a fine of 1 million nairas for conspiracy to hijack a fishing vessel. He got a similar reprieve like the others. Adamol Philip, aged 52 years, sentenced to 12 years and a 1 million nairas fine for conspiracy to hijack a fishing vessel, 2020. Philip also got his term reduced to 7 years and the fine waived. Matthew Marzi, aged 39, also sentenced to 12 years and a fine of 1 million nairas for conspiracy to hijack a fishing vessel. The sentence was reduced to 6 years, and the fine was waived. Right Agbade, 46, was also sentenced in 2020 for conspiracy to hijack a fishing vessel. Like the others in his category, he got a reprieve from President Tinubu. Signed, Bayo Onanuga, Special Advisor to the President, Information and Strategy on October 11, 2025.
Bringing you the news in a more digital way.